The Quarterly. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Lesson 1. Joshua 1. Entering the Land. The book of Joshua follows on where the book of Deuteronomy finished, with the death of Moses in the wilderness. See Deuteronomy 34. After the death of Moses, the people of Israel were ready to press on with the conquest of the Promised Land, in fulfillment of the promises the Lord first gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Genesis 12, 1-2, 15, 4-7, and so on. God provided the leader they needed in the person of Joshua, Moses' former assistant, and in the course of the book of Joshua, that commission to conquer the land will be largely fulfilled. The book of Joshua divides into three basic parts. 1. Entering and taking the land, Joshua 1-12. 2. Distributing the land, Joshua 13-21. And 3. Retaining the land, Joshua 22-24. As that outline makes clear, the book of Joshua is very much about the Promised Land. But it is also, and no less, about leadership. The book spans a single generation. It begins with the death of Moses and Joshua's succession, and it ends with Joshua's death and no one to succeed him. Who will provide the same kind of godly leadership for Israel after the death of Joshua? That question will be explored in the book of Judges, as well as the rest of the historical books. The book of Joshua thus serves as a hinge between the Pentateuch, Genesis to Deuteronomy, and the remaining historical books, Judges to 2 Kings, which trace the provision and subsequent tragic loss of the Promised Land and of the blessing of God's presence with his people. In Joshua 1, Joshua is commissioned to lead the people, and he guides them as they prepare to begin to invade the land of Canaan. The task is a deeply daunting prospect, a mission that 40 years earlier, 10 out of the 12 spies declared to be impossible. The land was filled with giants and defended by fortified cities, Numbers 13:28. But Joshua, one of the 2 dissenting spies, recognized that with God all things are possible, Matthew 19:26. If the people fought in their own strength, they could not win. But if the Lord were with his people, fighting for them, then the conquest will be straightforward. In the person of Joshua, Israel had precisely the kind of leader it needed to take on the battle for the land of Canaan, a leader in the tradition of Moses. Though Moses was dead, Joshua 1:2, Joshua was a worthy and well-prepared successor. This theme is reinforced in the Lord's lengthy speech to Joshua, the longest such speech in the book. There's little new information given to Joshua. Rather, the Lord is reiterating the same things he had previously told Moses, the Lord's servant. Numbers 27, 12-23, Deuteronomy 31 and 34. Though the Lord speaks to Joshua at crucial moments throughout the story, he does not speak to him in the same way that he spoke to Moses. Moses was the archetypal prophet, and the revelation given through him is foundational for the life of the people. See Numbers 12, verses 6-8. Joshua's task is to lead the people in keeping with the law that was given through Moses. Though Moses was dead, God's promise had not changed. Joshua 1:3. Because God's presence with his people had not changed. Verse 5. The Lord's promise was not initially made to Moses. It was made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God swore an oath to the patriarchs, and now he would fulfill that oath. With or without Moses, the people would receive the promised land as a gift from the Lord. The key word, the land, haaretz, occurs no fewer than 8 times with the verb give, natan, in this chapter. The opening charge to Joshua reflects the flow of the book as a whole, beginning with the crossing of the Jordan, chapter 1, verse 2, chapters 3-5, followed by conquering the land, chapter 1-3, and chapters 2, 6-12, settling its various tribal territories, chapter 1:4 and chapters 13 through 19, and committing to a life of obedient service to God, chapter 1 verses 5 through 9 and chapters 22 to 24. The book not only begins with the death, it also ends with the death and burials of Joshua, 24:30, the high priest Eleazar, 24:33, and the bones of the patriarch Joseph, in 24:32, all of whom find their promised rest in their family inheritance. God's promise of land and rest that is reiterated here has found its fulfillment by the close of the book, although, as we shall see, that fulfillment is still partial and incomplete. The boundaries of the promised land are described from south to north and east to west, Joshua 1:4, from the wilderness in the south to Lebanon in the north, from the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. Compare with Deuteronomy 11:24 to 25. Now these are not intended as precise boundaries so much as a sweeping promise of conquest, in which none of the land's present inhabitants will be able to stand before them. More precise borders are described in Numbers 34, verses 1 to 12, and Ezekiel 47, verses 12 to 20, both of which exclude the Transjordan from the Promised Land proper, unlike the book of Joshua, which is at pains to underline the unity of the 12 tribes at every opportunity. God's presence with Joshua and the people of Israel would be critical for everything that follows. Joshua 1:5. It is because the Lord is with Joshua, just as he was earlier with Moses, that Joshua should be strong and courageous, verse 6, and also verse 9. Joshua displayed considerable bravery in his earlier spying out of the land, and proclaiming that the land could easily be conquered with the Lord's help, in Numbers 13 to 14. But mere human bravery would not be enough for the task that faced him. The Lord would need to supply the strength that he commanded Joshua to possess. The Lord's presence with his people was a blessing when heading into battle against overwhelming odds. However, as Israel discovered in the wilderness, God's presence is a two-edged sword. It's good news to the obedient, to the one who fears God and keeps his commandments. But to the covenant breaker, God's nearness is a recipe for disaster. And so Joshua was instructed to be careful to obey all of the Mosaic law. Joshua 1:7 to 8. The land could only be possessed by Israel insofar as they devoted themselves to the study and the keeping of that law. Joshua would need to meditate on it day and night if he was to succeed in his mission. Compare Psalm 1 verse 2, or Deuteronomy 17 verses 18 to 19. Indeed, without strict obedience to the law, Joshua would not be successful even if Israel nonetheless managed to capture the land. Israel's calling was to be a holy nation, set apart for the Lord, Exodus 19:6. Obedience to God's direction and dependence upon God's power would be sufficient to enable Israel to capture the land. But disobedience would inevitably lead to disaster, and both themes are illustrated in the material that follows. The remainder of Joshua 1 addresses the question of the unity of God's people, chapter 1 verses 10 to 18. As they stood on the east side of the Jordan, ready to cross over into the Promised Land, there was the question of the commitment of the 2.5 tribes whose inheritance had already been won, who had been content to settle in the Transjordan, Numbers 32. Would the fragile unity of the tribes hold together, so that they would fight with their brothers to capture the remainder of the Promised Land? Or would they refuse, comfortable with the fact that their inheritance had already been secured? Joshua didn't waste time. He commanded the people to ready themselves immediately for action, Joshua 1:10. The period of 3 days here is not necessarily an exact period, it may be more like a few days, since the visit of the spies to Jericho in the next chapter would also take a certain amount of time. But it's clear that Joshua was in no mood to delay. The people were to be ready to move out at short notice, whenever he instructed them to do so. And that included all of the warriors from the 2.5 tribes of the Transjordan as well. Just as they had followed Moses, so too they would follow Joshua. But their answer to Joshua's summons is more than a mere affirmation of Joshua's leadership. In their reply, they reiterated the principal themes of the chapter. Just as the Lord commanded Joshua, so they would obey Joshua's commands. Verse 17. They reminded him that the Lord's presence was with him. Verse 17. And reiterated the Lord's charge for him to be strong and courageous. Verse 18. At this point in the story, all of God's people were playing from the same sheet of music. Israel seemed set for a victorious march through the land, sweeping aside everyone and everything that sought to block their path. However, as things unfold, we will discover that their progress in conquering the land would not be quite so simple. Application questions. 1. Who are some outstanding Christian leaders that you have known in your own life? What was it that made them exceptional? 2. As Christians, we don't have an earthly land to conquer. So how are the lessons of this book nonetheless relevant to us? 3. What obstacles to the unity of God's people do you see in your setting? 4. How is Jesus the ultimate answer to Israel's need for leadership and our need for leadership?